The wilderness keeps countless secrets. But the most dangerous truth is not what is hidden, but what is seen in a single, fleeting moment of damning silence. The Montana sun beat down on the man who called himself Silas Kane, each swing of his hammer a penance. Driving spikes into railroad ties was brutal, mindless work, and that was how he wanted it. The ache in his back drowned out the whispers of his memory, the ghosts of the Big Hole Valley he'd left behind. Silas was a name for a simple laborer, a man with no past. Caleb, the army corporal, was a name he had buried deep, along with the blue uniform he had abandoned. Here, among the sweat and steel, he was just another face, and he prayed to keep it that way. A few hundred yards away, where Grizzly Creek tumbled over smooth stones, Swift River moved with a quiet grace that belied the urgency of her task. Her deerskin dress, beaded with patterns of the morning star, was dark with moisture from the creekside mist. In her small leather pouch were the tiny purple mountain flowers her grandmother needed, the ones that grew only in the highest, most secluded places. The old woman's cough had grown worse, a deep rasp that stole the breath, and these petals were her last hope. She focused only on the plants, her world narrowed to this single, vital purpose. A distant rumble began to vibrate through the soles of Silas's worn boots. It wasn't the familiar clang of hammers, but something deeper, more powerful. The iron horse. He instinctively dropped his hammer and slid down the embankment, disappearing into the tall, sun-bleached grass. Across the tracks, Swift River heard it too. Her head snapped up, her calm focus broken. Years of caution taught by her elders took over, and she melted into a thicket of willows, her dark hair blending with the shadows. The train, a black serpent of smoke and steam, thundered into view, but it did not pass. With a hellish screech of metal on metal, the locomotive shuddered to a halt, hissing like a dying beast. Before the steam had even cleared, figures on horseback emerged from the pines, their faces covered by dark kerchiefs. The glint of sun on rifle barrels sent a cold spike of fear through Silas. From across the tracks, Swift River held her breath, her hand clutching the pouch of flowers to her chest. From their separate prisons of foliage, they watched in silence. They were now witnesses to something that would undoubtedly end in sorrow. The robbery was a violent storm, swift and merciless. Men shouted, horses stamped, and the heavy thud of crates hitting the ground echoed in the unnatural quiet. One of the train's guards, a man with more courage than sense, raised his firearm. A single, sharp crack split the air, louder than any hammer blow. The guard folded, a puppet with its strings cut, and fell beside the iron tracks without a sound. Swift River flinched, pressing herself deeper into the willows. The image of the falling man burned into her mind. The scent of gunpowder drifted on the breeze, acrid and final. Faster. Get the strongbox. The voice was muffled by cloth, but it carried the clear ring of command. In his impatience, the leader pulled down his bandana. The late afternoon sun illuminated his features, a thick mustache, a square jaw, and the cold, calculating eyes of a hawk. Silas felt the air leave his lungs. It was Josiah Reed, the founder of Eagles Crossing, the man who donated money for the new church. Across the way, Swift River's blood ran cold. She had seen this man in town, shaking hands and smiling. He was a pillar of his community, a wolf in the finest sheep's clothing. With the loot secured, the riders spurred their horses and vanished back into the pines. Silence descended again, thick and heavy, broken only by the whisper of the wind through the tall grass. In that dreadful calm, Silas lifted his head. His gaze shot across the tracks, past the still form of the guard, and locked with Swift River's. Her eyes, wide with shock, reflected his own terror. There was no need for words. In that shared glance, a terrible understanding passed between them, a silent acknowledgement of the truth and the mortal danger it carried for them both. The spell broke. Every instinct screamed at Silas to run, not back to the railroad camp where questions would be asked, but away, into the unforgiving wilderness. He scrambled from his hiding place and fled eastward toward the jagged peaks that clawed at the sky. On the other side of the tracks, Swift River clutched her pouch of useless flowers. Her path home was now a path to certain death. Without a second thought, she turned and ran, her moccasins making no sound as she disappeared into the deep woods, away from everything she knew. Josiah Reed rode into Eagles Crossing not as a bandit, but as a savior. He was the first to report the robbery, his voice ringing with manufactured outrage in the dusty saloon. "A savage attack," he declared, his fist hitting the bar. "They struck down a good man in cold blood." He painted a vivid false picture of a war party, preying on the fears that festered just beneath the town's civilized surface. A murmur of anger swept through the crowd. Reed fanned the flames, offering a reward that would turn neighbor against neighbor. $200 for any information. Miles away, Silas Kane pushed himself onward, his lungs burning. The reward money didn't matter. He knew men would hunt him for sport, for the mere suspicion of being a stranger near the scene. His tracks, left by army-issue boots, would be a clear signpost for any posse. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, sent a jolt of panic through him. He was no longer just a deserter running from his past. He was a witness running for his life, and the vast, empty wilderness felt less like a refuge and more like a trap closing in around him. Swift River moved with the certainty of someone born to the landscape, but her heart was a frantic drum against her ribs. She knew the rumor of a native attack would travel faster than a prairie fire, making every white man she encountered a potential executioner. She thought of her grandmother, waiting for medicine that would never arrive, and a wave of despair washed over her. She paused by a rushing mountain stream to catch her breath, her reflection a distorted mask of fear. That was when she saw it. The clear, deep print of a boot in the soft mud on the opposite bank. Silas froze, his hand instinctively reaching for the hunting knife at his belt. He saw her at the same moment, a lone figure, poised and still as a deer, across the water. It was the woman from the creek. The air thickened with suspicion. Was she tracking him? Was he tracking her? They stared at each other for a long moment, two solitary fugitives caught in the same invisible net. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, he lowered his hand. She gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. In that silent exchange, a fragile pact was made. Alone, they were prey. Together, they might just have a chance. Josiah Reed stood on the porch of his sprawling ranch house, the very picture of civic authority. He listened as the sheriff, a man whose pockets he lined, promised swift justice. But Reed knew the sheriff's posse was for show. For the real work, he summoned a different man. Leclerc emerged from the shadows of the stable, a wiry figure with eyes as pale and empty as a winter sky. A former trapper, he moved with a predator's economy of motion. "They were witnesses," Reed said, his voice a low growl. "A man and a Blackfoot woman. Find them. Make sure they never speak of this again." Silas put his army training to use, leading them over rock to hide their tracks and through rushing water to wash away their scent. He felt a grim irony in it. The skills taught to him to hunt men were now all that kept him from being hunted. Yet, behind them, Leclerc was relentless. He saw the things others missed: a single bent blade of grass, a pebble dislodged from a game trail. "The soldier is clever," Leclerc muttered to himself, a cruel smile touching his thin lips as he found a single dark thread from Silas's shirt snagged on a thorn bush. "But he bleeds like any other man." Meanwhile, a different kind of hunter arrived in Eagles Crossing. Captain Arthur Thorne, his blue uniform immaculate despite the trail dust, dismounted in front of the sheriff's office. He was a man defined by duty, and his current duty was to retrieve a deserter named Corporal Caleb Thorne, his own younger brother. The official story was desertion, but Arthur knew Caleb had fled after the slaughter at the Big Hole, his conscience shattered. He began his inquiries quietly, unaware that the man he hunted was the same man being pursued by Reed's silent assassin. Thorne's questions were methodical. He spoke to the railroad foreman, who remembered a quiet worker named Silas Kane, who had vanished. He spoke to the blacksmith, the saloon keeper. A pattern emerged, a loner who kept to himself, who disappeared the day of the train robbery. When the stable boy mentioned seeing a man matching Silas's description heading east toward the Beartooth Mountains, Thorne felt a cold certainty. He gathered his small detachment of soldiers. His mission to bring in a deserter was now leading him directly into the path of a far more dangerous chase. The Beartooth Mountains were a fortress of stone and wind, a place that broke the resolve of weaker men. They climbed for 2 days, the air growing thin and cold. Scrabbling across a steep shale slope, a loose rock shifted under Silas's boot. He cried out as his leg twisted unnaturally, a sharp crack echoing in the silence. Pain, white-hot and blinding, shot up his leg. He collapsed against the rock face, his face pale with sweat. He was trapped, a liability, and he knew it. "Go on without me," he grunted, the words tasting like ash. "They're not after you." Swift River ignored him. She surveyed their surroundings with a calm, appraising eye, then helped him half-drag, half-limp his way to a small overhang, sheltered from the wind. Her fingers, deft and gentle, explored his swollen ankle. From her pouch, she took not the mountain flowers, but a different collection of dried leaves and roots. Crushing them between two stones, she made a dark, fragrant paste. "This will draw out the fire," she said, her voice quiet but firm as she began to apply the poultice. He watched her, his pain momentarily forgotten, silenced by her competence. Night brought a fever that burned through him, dragging his ghosts out into the open. He was no longer Silas the laborer, but Corporal Caleb Thorne, lost in the smoke and terror of a dawn raid. "Not the children," he mumbled, his hands twitching. "We weren't supposed to—" Words tumbled out, broken images of a peaceful camp turning to chaos, of orders he couldn't follow. Swift River sat beside him, bathing his face with a cool, wet cloth. She listened not to the ramblings of a delirious man, but to the confession of a soul in torment. The fever broke with the dawn. He woke, weak but clear-headed, to find her watching him, her expression unreadable. The shame of his confession burned in his throat. "You heard?" he whispered. She simply nodded. He finally met her gaze, expecting condemnation, but saw only a shared sorrow. "I ran," he confessed, the words raw. "I couldn't be a part of it." She, in turn, told him of her grandmother, a keeper of stories in a world that no longer listened. In that cold mountain shelter, they were no longer just witnesses, but two people bound by the wounds the world had given them. Hunger became a constant, gnawing companion. While searching for edible roots near a thicket of aspens, the air grew still, and a low growl rumbled from the shadows. A grizzly, gaunt from a long winter, rose on its hind legs, its dark eyes fixed on them. Swift River froze, her hand clutching a digging stick. But Silas moved. With the quiet precision of a soldier, he gathered a handful of stones. He didn't aim for the bear, but for a sheer rock face 100 yards away. The sharp cracks of stone on stone echoed through the canyon, a convincing imitation of a rock slide. The bear dropped to all fours, its head snapping toward the new sound, and lumbered off to investigate the more immediate threat. Their relief was short-lived. From a high ridge they spotted them. 3 riders, moving slowly but surely along their back trail. It was Leclerc and his men closing the gap. They were cornered, a sheer cliff on one side and a steep, impassable drop on the other. Despair began to settle on Silas when Swift River placed a hand on his arm. She led him not away, but directly toward the cliff face. Hidden behind a curtain of ancient ivy was a fissure in the rock, a passage so narrow they had to shed their packs and squeeze through sideways into the cool, dark belly of the mountain. A sudden storm broke as they emerged on the other side, turning the world into a blur of rain and wind. They found shelter in a shallow cave, little more than a scoop out of the rock. The temperature plummeted. Shivering, their clothes soaked through, they huddled in the dark with only one thin, worn blanket between them. Without a word, Silas draped it over both their shoulders. They sat in silence, listening to the storm rage outside, their shoulders pressed together, sharing the small pocket of warmth in a world of biting cold. It was a fragile truce with the elements, and with each other. When the first light of dawn filtered into the cave, the storm had passed. The world outside was washed clean and quiet. Silas looked at Swift River, who was watching the rising sun paint the clouds. He saw not just an ally, but the woman who had tended his wounds, who had listened to his darkest secrets, who had guided him through a passage in solid rock. He realized the fear he felt was no longer just for his own life, but for hers. Their shared flight had twisted into something more. It was no longer just about survival. It was about protecting the only person in the world who knew his true name. After another day of careful travel, Swift River led him to a place hidden deep within a box canyon. It was an old winter camp, long abandoned. The skeletal remains of several lodges stood against the cliff walls, their weathered poles like the ribs of sleeping giants. For Swift River, it was a place of memory, of summers spent learning the ways of her people. For Silas, it was the first place in a week he felt he could breathe. "We will be safe here for a time," she said softly, her voice filled with a reverence for the silent, sacred ground. They had found a ghost of a home. For 3 days they lived in the quiet rhythm of the canyon. Silas's ankle began to heal, the swelling drawn out by Swift River's remedies. He learned to set snares for rabbits, a skill he hadn't used since he was a boy, while she showed him which roots were safe to eat and which held poison. They spoke of small things, the taste of fresh water, the warmth of the sun. The constant fear receded, replaced by a fragile peace. In these quiet moments, their shared glances held a warmth that had little to do with the small fire they built each night. But their trail had not gone cold. Miles back, Leclerc knelt in the dirt, a glint of color in his palm. It was a single blue bead, its thread broken, half buried in the mud near the mountain fissure. He recognized the pattern at once from Reed's description of the woman. He knew of the old winter camp in the Box Canyon, a perfect place to hide, but also a perfect trap. A slow, predatory smile spread across his face. He wasn't chasing them anymore. He was hurting them. He signaled to his men, and they changed direction, not following the trail, but cutting ahead to seal the exit. Leclerc and his men took up positions in the rocks overlooking the narrow mouth of the canyon, the only way in or out. He was a patient hunter. He had a clear field of fire and the certainty of his prey's path. Down in the canyon, Silas and Swift River were unaware, making plans to leave the next morning, heading north under the cover of darkness. Their brief respite had given them a dangerous gift, a sliver of hope. And as they prepared for their journey, Leclerc lay on the rock above, sighting down the barrel of his rifle, waiting for the dawn. Their false peace was broken by the quiet arrival of an old man leading a mule. He was a wiry French-Canadian trader named Pierre, a man who had traded with Swift River's people for 2 generations and knew the secret ways of the mountains. He found their camp not by tracking them, but by habit. Swift River felt a rush of relief at seeing a familiar face, a link to the life she had been forced to abandon. "Pierre, what news from the people?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. He offered her a sad smile and a small pouch of dried berries from his own supply. Pierre's news was a heavy stone. "Your grandmother. She is weaker," he said gently, avoiding her eyes. "The council worries. She calls for you." He explained that the lack of the specific mountain flowers had taken its toll, and the medicine keepers were running out of options. Swift River felt the world tilt. Her desperate flight had been to save her own life, but it may have cost her grandmother's. She stared into the fire, torn between the survival instinct that kept her here and the powerful pull of family and duty calling her back into the jaws of danger. After sharing what little food he had, Pierre continued on his way toward Eagle's Crossing. Near the foothills, he was stopped by a column of blue-coated soldiers. Captain Thorne, his face stern and questioning, approached him. "You come from the high country, old man. Did you see anyone?" Pierre, deeply distrustful of the army, shrugged. "The mountains are full of ghosts, Captain." But Thorne was persistent. "I'm looking for a white man, traveling with a native woman." Pierre's gaze hardened. "I saw 2 people trying to survive. That is all." But it was enough. The trader's evasiveness, the description, it solidified Thorne's suspicions. A deserter hiding in the wilderness would need a guide, someone who knew the land. It had to be Caleb. He thanked the old trader and turned to his sergeant. "The man we're looking for is in these mountains. We're changing course. We'll head for the box canyons near the fork of the river." He spurred his horse forward, his mind focused solely on finding his brother, completely unaware that he was riding toward a trap set by an entirely different hunter. "We leave at first light," Silas declared, his voice firm as he looked at Swift River. "Your grandmother would not want you to trade your life for hers. We go north, find a way around them, and live to fight another day." She saw the grim logic in his words and nodded, her heart a heavy stone in her chest. As the first pale rays of dawn spilled into the canyon, they gathered their meager belongings. They moved toward the canyon mouth, stepping from the deep shadows of the cliffs into the growing light, unaware they were walking directly into a predator's sights. A puff of dust exploded by Silas's feet, the sharp report of a rifle echoing a split second later. "That's far enough," Leclerc's voice boomed from the rocks above, dripping with smug satisfaction. "Nowhere left to run." Another shot chipped stone from the boulder they scrambled behind for cover. They were completely exposed, pinned down with no chance of escape or defense. Leclerc's men began moving down the rocky hillsides, their figures silhouetted against the morning sky, taking their time like cats cornering mice before the final, fatal pounce. Suddenly, a new sound cut through the tension. The thunder of hooves. A column of blue-coated soldiers galloped into the canyon mouth, led by an officer who shouted for his men to take cover. It was Captain Thorne's patrol. Leclerc's men, caught by surprise, immediately opened fire on the new arrivals. Thorne, seeing armed men firing from the rocks and two figures trapped below, believed he had stumbled into a full-scale ambush. The canyon erupted into a chaotic exchange of fire, a three-sided battle where no one understood who their true enemy was. Peering through a crack in the rock, Silas saw the officer's face and his blood ran cold. It was Arthur, his brother. In that moment of sheer desperation, he knew there was only one move left. Taking a deep breath, he stood up from behind the boulder, his hands raised high where they could be seen. "Arthur, don't shoot! It's me, Caleb!" he yelled, his voice raw. "These men, they robbed the train. They work for Josiah Reed." Leclerc's face contorted with fury. His secret was out. He swung his rifle away from the soldiers and leveled it directly at Caleb's heart. As Leclerc aimed, Swift River moved. She didn't scream or run. With a fluid motion, she scooped a smooth, heavy stone from the creek bed beside her. Her arm blurred as she threw it, not at Leclerc, but at the man closest to him. The rock struck the bandit's rifle just as he was taking aim at Thorne's men. The firearm clattered from his grasp, and the man staggered back with a cry of pain. That single, decisive action created an opening. It was all the soldiers needed. A volley of shots from Thorne's men answered Leclerc's treachery. One of the soldiers' rounds struck Leclerc in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending his rifle flying. The fight was over as quickly as it had begun. The remaining bandits, their leader wounded and their advantage lost, threw down their weapons and surrendered. Captain Thorne's men moved in, securing the outlaws with cold efficiency. The sudden silence in the canyon was deafening, broken only by the groans of the wounded trapper and the wind whistling through the rocks. The immediate danger had passed, leaving only the wreckage of the confrontation behind. Arthur Thorne approached slowly, his expression a conflict of duty and disbelief. "Caleb? What is the meaning of this?" Caleb did not lower his hands. He told his story, the words pouring out. The robbery, Josiah Reed's face, the hunt. Swift River stepped forward, her gaze unwavering as she met the captain's eyes, and spoke of what she had seen. Her quiet, dignified testimony held more weight than a dozen sworn oaths. Arthur looked from his brother's haunted face to the resolute woman beside him, then to the captured men. He saw the truth, stark and undeniable, in the morning light. "You are still a deserter, Caleb. I have to take you in," Arthur said, his voice heavy with regret. "But I will ensure that your testimony and hers is heard by the tribunal. I will speak on your behalf." He motioned for a soldier to gently secure Caleb's wrists. As they led him away, Caleb looked back at Swift River. Her face was not one of despair, but of fierce, unyielding strength. In their final, shared glance across the canyon, there was no goodbye, only a silent promise. To wait, to endure, and to fight for the future that had been forged in the heart of the wilderness.